McLaren's mega upgrades that made it a real contender to be F1's second fastest team came at a cost, and it needs to be fixed urgently. Back-to-back Lando Norris podiums turned into a lowly 7th at the Belgian Grand Prix in an abrupt end to McLaren's excellent recent form, with Oscar Piastri eliminated on the first lap for good measure. But even a normal race for both cars would have fallen well short of McLaren's sky-high recent standards, thanks to something McLaren sacrificed while chasing its game-changing upgrades, and addressing that is now a big priority. If you paid attention to any of the last few races, you'll have noticed McLaren featuring at the front of the grid a lot more than at the start of the season. The car's performance has been transformed by a host of upgrades introduced at the Austrian and British Grand Prix weekends, with Lando Norris finishing second 2 races in a row in Britain and Hungary. We'll come to just how much better the MCL60 is a bit later in this video, but what we've learned since those back-to-back podiums is what McLaren sacrificed to make the game-changing upgrades possible. At the Belgian Grand Prix, McLaren ended up running a bigger rear wing than it ideally wanted, and that left it extremely slow on the straights. Although different circumstances, like someone having a toe or the DRS, render individual data points misleading, we know that McLaren's drivers were consistently amongst the slowest in each meaningful session. Simply put, its range of rear wings doesn't include the kind of low drag special that would make a big difference at a circuit like Spa. The reason for this is that McLaren had been prioritising the development and production of its big package across both cars. That was such a big effort that the upgrades didn't arrive all at once, hence being split over races, and now there's work afoot to bring more upgrades later in the season, although this isn't guaranteed yet. Adding pure downforce to the car by reworking major areas like the floor, side pods and front wing is a more difficult and time-consuming problem than improving drag at a specific level. Not to oversimplify it, but that just means designing and producing a specific new rear wing. And that's just not something McLaren's been able to attack yet, because it was always behind other priorities that the technical department has been focused on. McLaren boss Andreas Stella admitted it's not like we wanted to target this configuration for Spa, and Norris felt that overall it was the correct thing to do because there's only 3 or 4 races that are as low downforce as this. Norris said he'd take the pain of a couple of bad weekends with the wrong rear wing in order to hit the heights like his brace of podiums, but he does hope that McLaren can now focus on other items. And he's getting his wish, as McLaren knows how important it is to address the problem rapidly. McLaren needs to prepare a low-drag rear wing for the Italian Grand Prix at Monza after the summer break, and as Stella put it after Norris spent the first half of the race at Spa getting destroyed on the straights, you can't go racing at Monza like this. In his words, there's urgent work that needs to happen at McLaren to fix the situation. This should mean a new wing for the Italian Grand Prix that McLaren couldn't produce before the summer break, and maybe another iteration at the end of the season at the new race in Las Vegas, which has a very long straight as well. If McLaren showed up to Monza with the current range of rear wings it has, then the race will probably be an unmitigated disaster. But at Spa, McLaren did actually benefit from it at times. The extra downforce really came in handy on F1's Sprint Saturday, as Oscar Piastri qualified second in a rain-affected shootout and finished in the same place behind Red Bull's Max Verstappen in a wet race. He even led briefly by virtue of switching from full wets to intermediates before Verstappen, but was inevitably overhauled at a safety car restart, where that rear wing really didn't help, as Verstappen was already passing the McLaren by Raidillon. But overall, McLaren was slightly less competitive than it was at the previous 3 events, with Piastri 6th fastest and Norris only 7th in qualifying for the main Grand Prix. In normal conditions, the wing was costly. Piastri was second quickest in the middle sector, where a bigger rear wing pays off. In terms of outright speed, the best reference is the Sector 1 timing loop at the end of the Kemmel Straight, where the McLaren was 14 kph down on the Red Bull. McLaren did have a smaller rear wing it could have used at Spa, but the suspicion going into the weekend was that as it is not that aerodynamically efficient, the gain in straight line speed would come at a cost in cornering performance and not necessarily be worthwhile. But by the end of the Belgian Grand Prix weekend, McLaren admitted it would have probably been worth it. McLaren thought the race start and safety car restarts were the main areas its drivers would be vulnerable, but Norris was a sitting duck in the first 2 stints, as McLaren underestimated how high the price would really be. Norris was briefly 6th on lap 1 after Piastri's elimination, but by lap 5 he'd fallen out of the points completely. His pained radio messages were laced with frustration and borderline desperation for McLaren to do something, anything, to help. The harsher than expected circumstances in the race left Norris fighting right at the back of the pack at one stage, and also brought the worst out of him in the first and second stints. No driver should be crucified for their emotions over the radio during a race that's going badly, and we've heard many grumble when things quickly go away from them in the heat of the moment, but it would probably serve Norris well to try to avoid being quite so surly in the future. Because while it's right to demand high standards and understandable to be disappointed when things go badly, getting on the radio just to sigh or complain or be a bit dismissive in response to race engineer questions and suggestions doesn't really help. It just creates unnecessary tension or pressure for those trying to find solutions. The flip side of that is if McLaren had the car in a specification that every other team managed to produce for Spa, the circumstances wouldn't have been created for Norris to get so downtrodden. And to his credit, he didn't let it impact his driving, as once things swung back in his favour with some mid-race rain that suited the bigger rear wing and the fact he'd nicely timed to switch to softs, Norris performed to a very high level and salvaged a points finish from absolutely nowhere. The difficulties of Spa might be followed up with at least some pain at Monza if McLaren cannot ready an out-and-out low drag special in time and even resorts to just trimming its existing wing. But as Norris said, if that's the cost of the big upgrades that have turned McLaren's season around, it will be worth it overall. The fact is that had McLaren finished second in the sprint race and 7th in the Grand Prix in any of the first 8 races, it would have been the team's best result of the year. Instead, doing that at Spa was disappointing. It's a sign of how impressive the burst of mid-season form has been, and it still stands as evidence of real and permanent progress. The Hungary podium in particular said more about the benefits of McLaren's upgrades than Norris's British Grand Prix podium did. Norris led at Silverstone, where McLaren was the second best team and should have had a double podium but for Piastri's misfortune with the timing of a safety car. That was an emphatically brilliant weekend. In Hungary, even if there was still the same excellent end result for Norris, it came from a degree of overachievement, a mix of good performance, a quality drive, and some circumstances falling McLaren's way, like Mercedes not doing as good a job as it should have. But it was extremely telling that McLaren could show that kind of performance on a very different kind of circuit, in very different conditions that would have been the stuff of nightmares for the team earlier this year. That's why McLaren had gone into the weekend not expecting a result as good as Silverstone. While the Austrian and British Grand Prix might have indicated that the peaks of the MCL60 have been raised, the races in Hungary and even Belgium to a degree were further proof that the basement has been lifted too. This upgraded McLaren copes better with extremely high track temperatures and traction zones, which means it looks after its tyres better than before. But there's still some work to do, which is why McLaren is considering further upgrades before the end of the year, although these might have to be rolled over to the 2024 car. There were some tyre degradation concerns at Spa, for example, and even though Hungary had been tipped to test how much better the MCL60 is now at slow speed corners, it wasn't the ultimate test. The Hungaroring track grips up really nicely through the weekend, and that helps mask some low speed limitations with traction, plus the softest tyres were available, and in reality the Hungaroring has more medium speed corners than probably any other track. So while there has clearly been an improvement in that corner profile, not just the fast corners, there are other tracks where there is probably worse to come, like maybe Zandvoort, the first race after the summer break, given that it has some very slow and long corners, or Singapore, as the majority of slow corners remain even though the layout has been slightly tweaked at the end of the lap. Another element to consider is that Norris and Piastri have also made it very clear over recent weekends that the car's not really any better to drive at any speed range, it's just going through those corners a bit faster. So there are clearly still some things from a handling side to be improved, which hints at a very long-standing problem going back 5 years or more. There have been subtle and not so subtle warnings from McLaren that some tracks and some weekends will bring more of the worst from the car rather than hide the negatives or accentuate the positives. This could be the case straight after the break, with back-to-back races on tracks that, had F1 raced there earlier in the summer, McLaren could have been badly exposed on.